The envelope on Samantha Reed's door looked small, but it carried the weight of everything she had been trying not to face. And as she stood in the narrow hallway of her Seattle apartment building, staring at her name written in firm black ink, she felt the last bit of denial slip away. 3 months earlier, she had walked out of her marketing job with a polite goodbye and a cardboard box of desk items, telling herself it was temporary, that she was talented, educated, capable, that another company would quickly see her value, but weeks turned into months. Savings disappeared faster than she expected, and each morning she opened her email hoping for good news, only to find rejection messages written in careful corporate language. Her apartment had once felt like independence, a small but bright space with wide windows that let in gray Pacific Northwest light, a secondhand couch she bought with pride, a tiny kitchen where she used to cook while listening to music. But lately it felt like a reminder of bills she could not meet. She peeled the notice from the door and closed it behind her quietly, leaning back against it as if holding the world outside, then unfolded the paper with shaking hands and read the words she already knew were there. Final reminder, overdue balance, immediate attention required, and though the message was formal and calm, it felt loud inside her chest. She walked to the kitchen counter and placed the letter beside a stack of unpaid statements, her mind racing through numbers she had memorized: rent due, credit card minimums, phone bill, all circling like a clock ticking too fast. She had stopped going out weeks ago, stopped buying anything unnecessary, canceled streaming subscriptions, stretched groceries carefully, yet it still wasn't enough. The hardest part wasn't the lack of money, it was the quiet loneliness that followed it. Friends who were busy building careers, family back in Ohio who believed she was doing great in the city, and her own pride that kept her from admitting how far she had fallen. She sank onto the couch and stared at the ceiling, remembering the excitement she felt when she first moved into this building 2 years ago, shaking hands with the landlord Daniel Brooks, signing the lease with confidence, promising herself she would build a strong future here. Daniel had seemed reserved but kind, the type of man who fixed things himself instead of hiring out when he could, always greeting tenants politely but never intruding. She had paid rent on time every month until the layoffs, and even when she missed the first payment, she convinced herself it would be the only one, that she would fix it before anyone noticed. But now the third notice lay in front of her like proof that effort alone does not always solve everything. She picked up her phone and checked her email again out of habit, scrolling past promotional ads and automated updates, hoping for a miracle message. But there was nothing new. The apartment felt too quiet, and she realized she had not spoken to anyone face-to-face in days except a cashier at the grocery store. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the window, a steady Seattle drizzle that matched her mood, and she felt tears gather but forced them back because crying would not change the numbers. She stood up and walked to the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection, noticing the dark circles under her eyes, the way stress had tightened her expression, and she whispered, "You'll figure this out," though her voice lacked conviction. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts, gentle but unmistakable, and her stomach dropped because she knew exactly who it had to be. She considered pretending she wasn't home, staying silent until the footsteps faded, but avoidance had already brought her this far, so after a deep breath she walked to the door and opened it slowly. Daniel stood there in a simple navy jacket, hands tucked into his pockets, his expression serious but not harsh, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She noticed he looked tired too, as if responsibility weighed on him in ways she had not considered before. "Hi, Samantha," he said calmly, his voice steady, and she felt embarrassment rise in her chest because she had always been the reliable tenant, the one who smiled in the hallway and paid early. "Hi," she replied quietly, bracing herself for formal warnings or final deadlines. Instead of stepping forward with authority, he remained at a respectful distance and said, "Can we talk for a minute?" And something in his tone sounded less like confrontation and more like concern. She nodded and stepped aside to let him in, quickly clearing a stack of papers from the small dining table to create space, suddenly aware of how visible her financial struggle was in scattered envelopes and unopened mail. Daniel glanced around briefly but without judgment, and she appreciated that he did not comment on the state of things. Her heart pounded as she waited for him to begin, preparing explanations she had rehearsed in her head about job searches and delayed interviews. But before she could speak, he said, "I wanted to check in before making any decisions." And that sentence alone caught her off guard. She had expected strict policy, not conversation. Standing there in her modest living room, facing the possibility of losing the last stable piece of her life, Samantha realized this moment would shape everything that came next. And as the rain continued to fall outside and the overdue notice sat quietly on the counter, she understood that sometimes the lowest point begins not with anger or chaos, but with a simple knock on the door and a question that could either close everything or open something she never expected. Samantha stood near the small dining table, her hands lightly gripping the back of a chair as Daniel stepped inside the apartment, closing the door gently behind him, and she prepared herself for numbers, deadlines, and formal words. But instead of pulling out paperwork, he looked at her with a calm expression and said he simply wanted to understand what had happened. The question caught her off guard because she had expected policy, not empathy, and for a moment she considered giving a short, safe answer, something polite and distant, yet the exhaustion in her chest pushed her toward honesty. She told him about the layoff, how the company had reduced staff without warning, how she packed her desk in silence while others avoided eye contact, how she walked out telling herself it was temporary. And as she spoke, her voice wavered but did not break. Daniel listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed, his attention steady. And when she explained the interviews that almost turned into offers but didn't, the careful budgeting, the nights spent revising her resume, he nodded slowly as if each detail mattered. She admitted she had been embarrassed to knock on his door and explain sooner, that she kept hoping the next week would bring a job and she would pay everything at once, and he responded not with criticism, but with a quiet statement that surprised her. He said he had noticed her routine change, that he saw her leaving early in professional clothes and returning later looking disappointed, and that he understood effort when he saw it. Samantha felt her defenses lower slightly because she realized she was not invisible in her struggle, and for the first time in weeks, she did not feel judged. Danielle then explained that owning the building came with responsibilities too: mortgage payments, maintenance costs, insurance, and that while he needed rent to keep things running, he did not want to make a rushed decision that would hurt someone who had always been reliable. His words were practical yet humane, and she appreciated the balance. She apologized again for the overdue months, her voice softer now, and told him she feared losing the apartment more than anything because it represented stability in a season where everything else felt uncertain. Daniel walked a few steps toward the window, thinking quietly, then turned back and said there might be a temporary solution if she was open to it. Her heart beat faster because hope can feel risky after repeated disappointment, but she nodded, willing to hear anything. He explained that managing the property had grown overwhelming lately, with new tenants moving in, maintenance requests stacking up, paperwork falling behind, and he admitted he had been considering hiring part-time help but had not yet found the right person. He looked at her directly and suggested that if she were willing to assist with administrative tasks, answering calls, organizing files, scheduling repairs, he could compensate her by reducing or covering part of the overdue rent, creating a structured agreement that would benefit them both. Samantha blinked in disbelief because she had expected a final warning, not an opportunity. She asked carefully whether he was serious, and he confirmed that he was, explaining that trust mattered to him and that she had proven dependable before her setback. The offer felt larger than just financial relief. It felt like dignity restored, like someone recognizing her skills instead of her debt. She asked what kind of hours he had in mind, and he described flexible afternoons in the small office downstairs, emphasizing that the arrangement would be professional and documented clearly to avoid confusion. She agreed quickly, almost afraid the option might disappear if she hesitated, and as they discussed practical details, schedule, tasks, expectations, she felt something shift inside her from helplessness to cautious determination. Daniel clarified that the goal was not charity but collaboration, that he believed in practical solutions during hard seasons, and she respected him more for framing it that way. When the conversation paused, the apartment felt different, less like a space on the edge of loss and more like a temporary challenge with a plan attached. Samantha realized how close she had been to isolation, how easily pride could have kept her silent until eviction became unavoidable, and she silently thanked herself for opening the door instead of hiding. Daniel prepared to leave after they agreed to start the following Monday, and before stepping out, he said he appreciated her honesty and would draft a simple agreement for clarity, his tone steady and respectful. As the door closed behind him, Samantha leaned against it again, but this time her breathing was steady, not panicked. She walked to the counter, picked up the overdue notice, and instead of seeing it as a final judgment, she saw it as a turning point. The numbers had not magically vanished. Her career was not instantly restored, yet the heavy cloud of uncertainty had lifted just enough to let light through. She opened her laptop immediately and began reviewing property management basics, researching software systems, preparing herself to show Daniel he had made the right choice. For the first time in weeks, her energy returned, fueled not by desperation but by purpose. She understood that this arrangement might be temporary, that she still needed a long-term career path, but she also recognized the deeper impact of someone choosing patience over punishment. As evening settled and the rain outside slowed to a light mist, Samantha brewed a simple cup of tea and sat at her small kitchen table with renewed focus, mapping out a schedule that balanced job applications with her new responsibilities. And though uncertainty still existed, it no longer felt like a closed door. It felt like a hallway with options. In that quiet apartment, where fear had once echoed loudly, there was now a subtle sense of partnership forming. Not romantic or dramatic yet, but grounded in mutual respect. And Samantha realized that sometimes help arrives not with grand gestures, but with a practical offer delivered in a calm voice, changing the direction of someone's life simply by saying, "Let's find a solution." Monday arrived with gray skies and a nervous energy Samantha had not felt in months, but this time, the feeling was closer to purpose than fear. And as she walked down to the small office on the ground floor of the building, carrying a notebook and her laptop, she reminded herself that this was not charity, it was work, and she intended to do it well. Daniel was already there when she knocked lightly on the open door, reviewing a stack of folders spread across his desk, and he looked up with a polite smile that eased some of her tension. The office was modest but organized, with a large corkboard filled with maintenance schedules, tenant contact lists, and reminders written in neat handwriting. And Samantha immediately noticed areas where her marketing background could bring structure. Daniel began by showing her the filing system, explaining how lease agreements were stored, how service requests were logged, and how he tracked monthly payments manually. And as he spoke, she listened closely, asking clear questions, taking notes quickly, her mind shifting back into professional mode. Within the first hour, she created a simple spreadsheet to organize pending repairs and upcoming lease renewals. And Daniel watched with quiet approval as she moved efficiently between tasks, her confidence returning in small but visible ways. The phone rang mid-morning, and though she hesitated for half a second, she answered with a steady voice, assisting a tenant who needed clarification about parking assignments. And when she hung up, Daniel nodded slightly as if to say she handled it well. The pace of the day picked up naturally. Emails to respond to, a plumber appointment to confirm, a vacant unit listing to update. And Samantha felt the satisfaction of productivity replace the heaviness that had followed her for weeks. During a short coffee break, Daniel handed her a mug without ceremony, simply placing it on her desk with a quiet, "Thought you might need this." And she smiled, appreciating the gesture not as something dramatic but as thoughtful. Their conversations remained focused on work, yet small details slipped in between tasks. He mentioned growing up in Portland. She shared how she moved to Seattle for opportunity, and neither pushed beyond comfortable boundaries. As the week progressed, Samantha streamlined the tenant communication process, drafted a clear email template for maintenance requests, and even suggested a simple social media listing strategy for vacant units, which Daniel accepted with visible relief. He admitted that juggling everything alone had been overwhelming, and she realized that while she had seen him only as a landlord before, he too carried pressure quietly. One rainy evening, they stayed late finalizing paperwork for a new tenant, and the office lights cast a warm glow against the windows, while rain streaked down the glass, creating a calm atmosphere that felt far from the stress of unpaid bills. Samantha noticed how Daniel approached problems, steady, patient, never rushed, and she felt respect growing naturally. When their hands briefly brushed as they reached for the same folder, the contact was light and unplanned, but it lingered in her awareness longer than expected. Not inappropriate, just human. She quickly refocused on the task, reminding herself that this arrangement was built on professionalism. Yet she could not ignore the subtle shift in how comfortable their presence felt around each other. Days turned into weeks, and Samantha began balancing job applications with property duties smoothly, her mornings spent sending resumes, her afternoons assisting in the office, and the rhythm gave her life structure again. Daniel occasionally asked about her interviews, not out of obligation but genuine interest, and when she mentioned a promising phone screening, he encouraged her calmly, saying she deserved a place that recognized her skills. One afternoon, as they reviewed tenant renewal forms, he shared a piece of his own story, explaining how he once invested in opening a small cafe that failed after a difficult economic season, how he had felt embarrassed telling friends it did not work out, and how managing this building became his way of starting over quietly. Samantha listened carefully, understanding the courage it took to admit failure without bitterness, and in that shared honesty, she felt a deeper connection form, rooted not in romance but in mutual resilience. The office environment slowly shifted from purely transactional to quietly supportive, where jokes about stubborn printers or late maintenance calls lightened stressful moments, and Samantha realized she laughed more freely than she had in months. One evening, after successfully coordinating a last-minute repair that prevented a tenant's inconvenience, Daniel thanked her sincerely, saying her presence had changed the way the building operated, and she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with finances. She began to see herself not as someone rescued from eviction, but as someone contributing meaningfully, and that difference restored her dignity. As winter eased into early spring, the routine became second nature, and the office felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like a shared project. Yet beneath the professional surface, there was a gentle awareness between them, a careful respect that neither rushed nor denied. Samantha found herself looking forward to afternoons downstairs, not just for the structure, but for the quiet conversations that followed long tasks, the shared understanding that both of them had faced setbacks and were rebuilding steadily. She remained focused on her career search, determined not to depend permanently on this arrangement, but she also recognized that something valuable had grown in this season: confidence, stability, and a connection built on trust rather than urgency. And as she locked the office one evening beside Daniel, the cool Seattle air brushing against them as they stepped outside, she realized that what began as a solution to overdue rent had quietly become a turning point in her life. Not because someone saved her, but because two people chose cooperation over judgment, creating space for growth where fear once stood. Spring arrived softly in Seattle, and with it came a quiet shift in Samantha's life that felt both exciting and uncertain, because while she had regained stability working alongside Daniel, she still carried the hope of rebuilding her own career fully. One bright afternoon, as she sorted tenant emails in the office, her phone buzzed with a notification that made her pause, and when she opened the message and read the words, "We are pleased to offer you the position," her breath caught in her throat. She read the email twice to be sure it was real. A full-time marketing role at a growing local startup, steady salary, benefits, a fresh beginning. And for a second, she simply sat there absorbing the moment, remembering the nights she had doubted herself, the mornings she had questioned her worth. Without thinking, she stood quickly and walked to Daniel's desk where he was reviewing invoices, her eyes bright in a way he had not seen before. "I got the job," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and joy, and he looked up instantly, understanding from her expression that this was the news she had been waiting for. He stood and congratulated her warmly, genuine pride in his tone, telling her he never doubted she would land somewhere that valued her skills, and she felt gratitude not just for the encouragement, but for the steady presence he had been during her hardest weeks. Yet as the excitement settled slightly, a new awareness entered the room, because this job meant change, and change meant the arrangement that had brought them together would end. Daniel nodded thoughtfully and mentioned they would need to adjust the rent agreement back to normal terms once her salary began. His voice calm but carrying a hint of distance she had not heard before. Samantha realized that while she had longed for this opportunity, she also feared losing the daily connection they had built through shared work and quiet conversations. She assured him she would cover the remaining balance fully once her first paycheck arrived, and he responded that there was no rush, that her reliability had already proven itself, and in that moment she understood that their relationship had moved beyond simple transaction. Over the next few weeks, Samantha balanced training at her new job with wrapping up her responsibilities at the property office, carefully organizing files, updating spreadsheets, and preparing clear notes so Daniel could manage smoothly alone. Each afternoon felt meaningful, not heavy, and they worked efficiently but with an unspoken awareness that this chapter was closing. One evening, after finalizing a lease renewal, they sat across from each other in the quiet office, sunlight fading through the windows, and Samantha thanked him sincerely, telling him that his willingness to offer her work instead of judgment had restored her confidence when she felt completely defeated. Daniel listened without interrupting, then admitted that her presence had helped him more than he expected to, that her organization and steady support had reduced his stress in ways he had not anticipated. The honesty between them felt natural, grounded in mutual respect, and as they locked the office for what would be her last official shift, there was a pause. Neither wanted to rush. Outside, the air carried the scent of early blossoms, and Samantha turned to him with a thoughtful smile and said she would still be living upstairs, just not working downstairs. And he smiled back, saying he was glad the building would still have her light in it. She hesitated for a brief second, then gathered the courage to suggest dinner sometime, not as employer and assistant, but simply as two people who had shared a meaningful season, and the invitation was gentle, free of pressure. Daniel's expression softened, and after a quiet breath he agreed, saying he would like that very much. The simplicity of that exchange held more weight than grand declarations could have, because it was built on patience and trust. Weeks later, Samantha settled into her new job confidently, bringing fresh ideas to her team, earning early praise. Yet she noticed that each evening when she returned home, she felt a small anticipation knowing Daniel might be in the courtyard or checking mail. Their first dinner was relaxed and comfortable, filled with conversation about goals, past lessons, and plans for the future. And there was no need to pretend perfection because both had already seen each other at low points. Samantha realized that what began as financial rescue had quietly transformed into companionship rooted in shared resilience. She paid her rent on time again, proudly, not out of fear but stability. And Daniel treated her not as a tenant who once struggled, but as an equal. Over time, their dinners became regular, their walks through the neighborhood natural, and the building that once symbolized near loss became the place where she rebuilt both career and heart. Looking back, Samantha understood that being broke and hopeless had not defined her. It had refined her, teaching humility, patience, and the power of accepting help without shame. Daniel, too, recognized that offering support had opened his life to connection he did not expect. And as months passed and their bond grew steadily stronger, Samantha no longer saw that overdue notice as a mark of failure, but as the quiet turning point that led her to both professional renewal and a partnership built on kindness. In the end, she was not saved by luck or sudden fortune, but by courage to face her situation honestly, and by a landlord who chose compassion over convenience, proving that sometimes the door you fear opening becomes the doorway to everything you needed all along.